Welcome to the future of payroll and workforce management insights by HR.com, your go-to resource for insights into payroll and workforce management. From navigating compliance and technology trends to exploring the latest in global payroll solutions, we're here to keep you ahead of the curve. Join us as we dive into the forces reshaping payroll and share practical strategies to optimize your workforce management. Let's get started. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Future of Payroll and Workforce Management, a podcast here at HR.com, where I am your host. My name is Brent Skinner. I do several things at HR.com, but this episode, as all the episodes are, is about my guest, and my guest is Steve Lenderman, who is Head of Fraud Prevention at isolved. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Brent, how are you?
I'm good.
Good.
Yeah. And you've been on the podcast a while back, almost a year ago, I think, at this point.
Yeah, time flies, huh?
Yeah, it does. I think maybe it was around late spring, early summer, but in any event, it was a lot warmer than it
Oh,
is
yeah,
right
definitely
now.
warmer.
And most people will be watching this. Will have been about a month after the Super Bowl, but that was I don't know what to say about that Super Bowl. It was kind of weird. Um,
Definitely was perplexing. Let's leave it at that.
Yes, we will. So we have an interesting topic here to talk about. Payroll fraud is hiding in plain sight, and it's getting smarter. And we're going to talk about that. But as I like to ask all my guests at the outset of these episodes, what got you into payroll or HR or whatever it is? There's a lot of real passion and purpose in work in this particular in this profession, these professions around human capital management. What's your story, Steve?
Yeah, so been in the fraud space for about 26 years or so now, right? Most of that spent in the banking world. And about 7, 8 years ago, was approached by an individual about an opportunity at a very large payroll provider with 3 letters in it. And I was intrigued because I'm trying to figure out, like, well, how much fraud is there in payroll, right? Coming from the banking sector, I've lived and breathed that my entire life. And then realized, getting my feet wet there, understanding, yeah, there is a significant amount of fraud in the payroll space, just like any other place, right? The old adage, like, why do people rob banks? That's where the money is. Well, there's lots of money moving in and out of payroll spaces as well, right? And so that's how I ended up in the payroll world, and my second stint here in the payroll fraud world, and doing a lot of interesting stuff and working with our organization and others and some working groups, and really trying to expand, this concept of cross industry fraud prevention, right? It's payroll, it's banking, it's insurance, it's crypto, it touches everything. So that's why we're here.
Yeah, yeah, and you know a lot about payroll fraud and prevention. So there's a lot of new stuff. It's a moving target. It's an evolving playbook, and a lot of organizations are still treating it like a niche risk. We're going to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. We're going to talk about, you know, many ignore the F word in payroll, which is fraud, right?
Yeah.
But in our conversation won't. Um, so let's get to it here.
Yeah.
I have my first question for you is around, signals that payroll and HR teams miss that indicate fraud. What are the most common ones when fraud has already entered the process, especially during hiring or onboarding, maybe?
Yeah. So if we're looking at what I call post-account fraud, right, where an account's already been opened, right, and they're a client of an organization, and so you typically tend to see what we call account takeovers. And these are signals where an individual has their credentials compromised in some way, shape, or form. A bad actor logs in and then does something to their account. That could be as simple as changing a direct deposit, we call payroll diversion. That could be anything else as well, right? Once they're in the account of either the administrator or the employee, they can do whatever they want to in that account, right? And so I think what we're seeing in the space is this proliferation of account takeovers coming from the banking sector right into our world now. And so a lot of common signals that are there that people just don't tend to think about, are just essentially how they come into your network, how fast they're on your page, how long they're on your page, what type of activity they're doing when they're in the account, right? It's you know, two-factor authentication is certainly helping with the account takeover fraud for sure, but it is still very vulnerable, right? And so the best version of two-factor authentication you could use is a passkey, right? And all too often in the payroll world, many organizations are still relying on, you can use email as a two-factor authentication, which, to be blunt, is not effective. It doesn't work, right? And so if you're using email as a two-factor authentication, you need to stop. You need to really think about doing that. At least get to an SMS, at least get to an authenticator app, but please think about going to passkey for sure. Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting. You got me to thinking, yeah, why would email not be effective for two-factor authentication? Well, okay, if it's SMS, it's just going to your phone
Mhm.
as opposed to anybody can log into your email maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, think about your emails, right? Most of our email address is our first credential, right? Is your username. So if you have the opportunity to not use your email address as a username, just anywhere in general, right? Even your own personal world, don't, right? Because everybody knows your email address, right? And therefore, half your credential is already compromised. Like it's not difficult to figure out it's first name dot last name, initial, last name, etc. And then obviously the use of passwords. Like these came out in the early 70s, and here we are in 2026, still talking about passwords. They are clearly compromised, and so let's get away from those if we can, right? SMS is again a step up, but there are ways to manipulate a phone as well. And anytime there is a security, we call a token, a password, a two-factor token, or an authenticator app token that are visible, right, in the wild, right, to a human being, there is a vulnerability there, right, which is why passkeys are secure because their token is not exposed, right? It's a passkey from a device to a user to a platform, and that token is never exposed for the bad guys to see.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear about this, and I know we want to talk a little bit more about what are some of the other sort of newfangled fraud schemes that are out there that affect payroll. I know we've talked about, in the past when we talked about doing this episode, Steve, I know we talked about new account fraud.
Yeah.
Um, how does that work? I'm
Yeah.
guessing that's a little bit different than what you just described.
Yeah, it's so that we talked about account takeover as kind of post-account fraud, right? And so this would be almost like pre-account, right? Where you have a bad actor who is going to open a payroll account at a particular provider, and then use that account to obviously commit fraud. And so you would typically see one of two kind of attack vectors in the space, using the identity of a business owner or the business itself, and stealing the identity and then applying for that with some different identifiers here and there, but the business is still the business, right? And so, and the unique thing about when I steal a business identity or a business owner's identity, right? Um, it's not like the banking world, right? It's because most payroll organizations are not running like credit checks. And so if I stole your identity and used it to open up a payroll account, it's not the same as if I stole your identity to open up an account at a credit card company, which you would see on your credit reports, right? And so I can steal your identity as a business owner and use it, and you as the owner we have no idea that I'm using it until someone came back to you and said, "Hey, you're 90 days late on this invoice. You have a loan here. You owe us money for a payroll that you ran with your company." And you're going, My payroll's over there. I don't use your company as payroll." And that gets really, really kind of a scary thing. And then the second way you can kind of come into new account fraud is, um, you know, stealing an identity of the owner or the business. Is relatively easy to do, but there's still some work there, right? So why do that? Why just create one yourself? So we see synthetic identities and synthetic entities being created at scale now because of AI. It's much easier to create them than it is to steal them, and so you're seeing this influx of new accounts coming into the payroll space with fully synthetic information that is beating a lot of systems. A lot of our organizations in the payrolls world still think of KYC, know your customer, and KYB, know your business. as fraud controls, and they are absolutely not a fraud control. They are a regulatory box checking exercise that does not stop a fraud, because every fraud passes a KYC or a KYB.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And synthetic information, just for some of the uninitiated in our audience, this is completely fabricated information that's maybe generated by artificial intelligence, maybe,
Yeah,
or
yeah. So essentially, you're creating a digital ghost, right? As physical individuals, where we have a name, a date of birth, a social, phone numbers. These are all pieces of data that identify us, right? And so I can create that essentially a digital person with those same identifiers, right? And then I start to put those identifiers into the data aggregator systems that are out there, whether the Googles or LinkedIn or credit bureaus, et cetera. And that data starts to aggregate and become like a real person, right? And so, we will date ourselves here. When we turned 18, a few years ago for both of us, you became like new in the financial world, right? At 18, you kind of became your financial birth, right? Your name became credit, et cetera, right? Well, that similar concept can happen here, right? Where I create a digital identity, use that as a business owner, then I create a synthetic business, the entity, which is relatively simple to do. And both those can be essentially at scale and with efficiency. I did use a fraud tool called Fraud GPT. Yes, it sounds just like Chat GPT, but it is not where you want to go. And built a fully functioning synthetic identity in 7 minutes. Um, so it's pretty easy to do.
and this, so the, and this synthetic identity is not, this is not a stolen identity. This is
No,
just, yeah,
completely
yeah,
fictitious. Yeah, I mean there were some ways to use some identifiers of like children or deceased or the elderly, right, who are not using their identity as much as you or I would be using it, right? So I steal bits and pieces of that. But the reality is yeah, it's completely fictitious. There is no victim, right? There's no one complaining. There's no one to arrest, right? It just doesn't exist, right? And that's where it gets really, really scary, is that it looks real, but it's not. And in the payroll space, if I start using these synthetic identities in a payroll environment, right, then I start creating like tax records with them, right, and pay stubs and things that now make you look even more legitimate than you were before. Now, someone asks you for a pay stub. Well, here's a legitimate pay stub with obviously fraudulent, fictitious information on it, but the pay stub itself is authentic, right? And so it's going to pass document checks, counterfeit checks, et cetera. So you can see why it'd be advantageous for synthetic identity actors, one, to create new account fraud to get the money, but two, because it also validates their identities. It's a win-win for them.
yeah, and it really dovetails. There's a real sort of butterfly effect, that's a long tail effect, across all sorts of things well beyond payroll, getting a car loan, getting
Yeah.
a mortgage,
Yep.
applying for credit, all these sorts of things. That is there's sort of the root of all evil, maybe, or the sort of the origin point. There's a couple things I want to get to. One,
Yeah.
in a few minutes here, it's just I know that there's an industry group that you're heavily involved in, the PFPG,
Yep.
um, and I want to get into that, but first, can you just maybe expand on this concept of, too many organizations, they're still treating payroll fraud as a niche risk.
Yeah.
What should they be doing instead? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. So traditionally, when you think of the word payroll fraud, right, you typically think of the old style of fraud, right, which is ghost employees, time card manipulation, commission manipulation, et cetera. Right? These are what again still happen, still very viable. But what bad actors have realized is, the same frauds they were committing in the banking sector, right, can also be committed in the payroll space, in the insurance world, in the government world, right? And so they're moving to the areas of least resistance that are least prepared for preventing fraud. And payroll is one of those industries that is certainly at risk and exposed here. A lot of the organizations are doing some pretty good things on understanding that we need to protect ourselves like a bank, because we look like a bank. Remember, we send money, we receive money, we hold money. We just sell payroll products, right? So we are a bank, and that's one thing that we're looking at. Things here at isolved and other locations I've been at is making us bankish from a fraud prevention perspective,
Yes.
right? And that is a huge differentiator between a lot of organizations where you're using KYC as their fraud tool. And so you have to just understand that it's not a matter of like, if it's going to happen to you, like it already is happening. I'll be brutally honest. And so the when question's already been answered too. You just have to go find it or look for it. And that's probably another blind spot organizations in the payroll world think about it. Well, that's just a bad client, right? Who didn't do well, and they don't think about it. That maybe that whole client was fictitious in the first place, right? So they charge it off as bad debt or bad business, and it really was fraud, right? So it's kind of the hidden secret.
Yeah, yeah, and it's that mindset of really thinking outside of yourself as a payroll department or a vendor of payroll
Yeah,
technology, right? And
yeah,
really shifting into that banking mindset. You should
yep,
have that sort of that finance mindset when it comes to halting and averting and preventing fraud. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Um, so let's talk a little bit about that industry group because it's very interesting and it's good to see cooperation out
yeah.
there in the wild to amongst creators of technology for payroll and other leaders in the space. What is that all about? What's going on there? How can people get involved?
Yeah, so the PFPG, Payroll Fraud Prevention Group, right, is an industry-specific working group that has about between 40 and 50 members from the payroll world, from the big players to the small to the medium. So it's a fantastic opportunity. It is membership driven. There is a fee there that helps us create the infrastructure needed to help manage fraud, right? And one of the best things that we do at PFPG is a consortium of data, right? And so we're sharing trends, we're sharing information about what we're seeing with each other, we're helping each other, right? And so despite the fact that we may be competitors from a market perspective, right? All of the members of the PFPG in the fraud world, we're all collaborators, right? We have to be to understand, and we will see the threat actors move from one platform to another, and it's up to us as the working group, to prevent that from happening, right? And so we all do collaborate very well. We meet once a month. We have an annual conference we go to and attend to, and it's really a pretty fantastic environment, right, to be able to share information, because as big as the payroll space is, let's be brutally honest, it's not the banking sector, right? And we are able to still do something like this. Like doing something like this in the banking world would be almost impossible because it's just too big. Here, it's very viable, very organic, and the people who belong to the organization actually like contribute, right? They're not just consumers; they are contributors, and that is what makes it collaboration really, really helpful.
I would imagine pulling some people in from the finance sector is probably well PFPG probably already does that. Um, it's really interesting, and it also interesting to think about what kind of fraud prevention best practices the PFPG might be developing that might
Yeah,
be helpful
yeah,
to other sectors of industry as well.
yeah, yeah. That's what's also interesting about PFPG is look, every organization as the member obviously treats fraud seriously because they're contributing and part of the group. But doesn't mean everybody in the group necessarily like me comes from a fraud background. We have risk people there, we have technical people there, right? A lot of organizations in the payroll space just don't have a dedicated fraud person, right? So the fraud person is going to be a compliance person and also legal, and that may also be someone in their technology world, right? And so we have a lot of people who wear different hats in the group, which gives us different perspectives on how to solve different problems, right? So that's really helpful for us to be able to do that. Now, from that perspective, right, like what else do we do, right? From a industry perspective, we do have some best practices that we share with each other, right? Like, hey, how do you handle this in that scenario? It is essentially Chatham House rules, right? We're sharing intelligence with each other, right? We do not want that out to the bad guys to show, well, this company is stopping ATOs by doing this. We don't want
Right.
that out there, right? We don't want the recipe to commit fraud out there. But we also do a lot of consumer education and awareness, right? Some webinars that are out there, best practices around things like pass keys, for example, and removing passwords, about how you can protect your business identity as well, right? Like things you should do, like look at your Dun& Bradstreet records, right? If you're a business owner, every 90 days, you should look at Secretary of State registration to make sure that a bad actor hasn't gone in and changed that without your knowledge, right? So we do provide some tools and tips for business owners on how to protect themselves and protect their business, which ultimately protects their employees, right? Because, ultimately a fraud can put a business out of business, and that means the employees are also jobless. So the trickle down effect can be quite robust when you start really, diving down into it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. And yeah, you don't want to give away the secrets, right? You want there to be a lot of mystery to this, but at the same time, you want to help people understand. So there's the advocacy arm of it, and also
Mhm.
sort of the solution focused arm of it. And that part of it is sort of, a black box, and then you have the transparency white box for the
Yep.
other. Um, Really interesting stuff, Steve. And I know we could talk about payroll fraud for many hours. I know that. We this is a podcast, so we got to conclude now. But thanks for joining me. This
That's
is
always fun.
really yeah. This is some stuff that our audience is really going to find helpful.
I appreciate the time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Future of Workforce Management and Payroll Insights by HR.com. We hope today's episode brought you valuable insights and fresh perspectives on the future of payroll and workforce management. Be sure to check out more episodes and explore resources at HR.com/podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep innovating and making a difference in the world of payroll and workforce management.